Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be reading and discussing the Sammādiṭṭhi Sutta in its entirety. The name of this sutta translates from Pali to Right View Discourse, or Discourse on Right View, and it is very unique because it's one of the few sutta texts in the Pali Canon that is not a sermon given by the Buddha himself. Instead, it is given by his foremost disciple, Shariputra. For more on Shariputra and his life and times, check out episode 44, Who is Shariputra?, which will be linked in the show notes. As you know, right view is the first element on the Eightfold Path, the path prescribed by the Buddha that leads to the cessation of dukkha. Shariputra, being the foremost disciple in wisdom, is known throughout the canon as being the most knowledgeable on the earliest iterations of the Buddha's teachings, and so he often serves as the Pali Canon's representative or advocate in later Mahayana discourses, where he defends the earlier teachings and challenges the Buddha to make his ongoing teaching reconcile somehow with what he taught before. The Sammādiṭṭhi Sutta is the 9th discourse in the Majjhima Nikāya of the Pali Canon, and today we're using the 1998 Ñanamoli Thera and Bhikkhu Bodhi translation. We hope you enjoy. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was living at Savatthi in Jeta's grove, Anathapindika's park. There, the Venerable Shariputra addressed the bhikkhus thus, "Friends, bhikkhus." "Friend," they replied. The Venerable Shariputra said this, one of right view is said, friends. In what way is a noble disciple one of right view, whose view is straight, who has perfect confidence in the Dharma, and has arrived at this true Dharma? Indeed, friend, we would come from far away to learn from the Venerable Shariputra the meaning of this statement. It would be good if the Venerable Shariputra would explain the meaning of this statement. Having heard it from him, the bhikkhus will remember it. Then, friends, listen and attend closely to what I shall say. Yes, friend, the bhikkhus replied. The Venerable Shariputra said this. When, friends, a noble disciple understands the unwholesome, the root of the unwholesome, the wholesome, and the root of the wholesome, in that way he is one of right view, whose view is straight, who has perfect confidence in the Dharma, and has arrived at this true Dharma. And what, friends, is the unwholesome? What is the root of the unwholesome? What is the wholesome? And what is the root of the wholesome? Killing living beings is unwholesome. Taking what is not given is unwholesome. Misconduct in sensual pleasures is unwholesome. False speech is unwholesome. Malicious speech is unwholesome. Harsh speech is unwholesome. Gossip is unwholesome. Covetousness is unwholesome. Ill will is unwholesome. Wrong view is unwholesome. This is called the unwholesome. And what is the root of the unwholesome? Greed is a root of the unwholesome. Hate is a root of the unwholesome. Delusion is a root of the unwholesome. This is called the root of the unwholesome. And what is the wholesome? Abstention from killing living beings is wholesome. Abstention from taking what is not given is wholesome. Abstention from misconduct in sensual pleasures is wholesome. Abstention from false speech is wholesome. Abstention from malicious speech is wholesome. Abstention from harsh speech is wholesome. Abstention from gossip is wholesome. Non-covetousness is wholesome. Non-ill will is wholesome. Right view is wholesome. This is called the wholesome. And what is the root of the wholesome? Non-greed is a root of the wholesome. Non-hate is a root of the wholesome. Non-delusion is a root of the wholesome. This is called the root of the wholesome. When a noble disciple has thus understood the unwholesome, the root of the unwholesome, the wholesome, and the root of the wholesome, he entirely abandons the underlying tendency to lust. He abolishes the underlying tendency to aversion. He extirpates the underlying tendency to the view and conceit, I am, and by abandoning ignorance and arousing true knowledge, he here and now makes an end of suffering. In that way, too, a noble disciple is one of right view, whose view is straight, who has perfect confidence in the Dharma, and has arrived at this true Dharma. Saying, "Good friend," the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Shariputra's words. They then asked him a further question. But, friend, might there be another way in which a noble disciple is one of right view, and has arrived at this true Dharma? There might be, friends. When, friends, a noble disciple understands nutriment, the origin of nutriment, the cessation of nutriment, and the way leading to the cessation of nutriment. In that way he is one of right view, and has arrived at this true Dharma. And what is nutriment? What is the origin of nutriment? What is the cessation of nutriment? And what is the way leading to the cessation of nutriment? There are these 4 kinds of nutriment for the maintenance of beings that already have come to be, and for the support of those seeking a new existence. What for? They are physical food as nutriment, gross or subtle, contact as the second, mental volition as the third, and consciousness as the fourth. With the arising of craving, there is the arising of nutriment. With the cessation of craving, there is the cessation of nutriment. The way leading to the cessation of nutriment is just this noble eightfold path. That is, right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. When a noble disciple has thus understood nutriment, the origin of nutriment, the cessation of nutriment, and the way leading to the cessation of nutriment, he entirely abandons the underlying tendency to greed. He abolishes the underlying tendency to aversion. He extirpates the underlying tendency to the view and conceit, I am, and by abandoning ignorance and arousing true knowledge, he here and now makes an end of suffering. In that way, too, a noble disciple is one of right view, whose view is straight, who has perfect confidence in the Dharma and has arrived at this true Dharma. Saying, "Good friend," the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Shariputra's words. They then asked him a further question. But friend, might there be another way in which a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dharma? There might be, friends. When, friends, a noble disciple understands suffering, the origin of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the way leading to the cessation of suffering, in that way he is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dharma. And what is suffering? What is the origin of suffering? What is the cessation of suffering? What is the way leading to the cessation of suffering? Birth is suffering. Aging is suffering. Sickness is suffering. Death is suffering. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are suffering. Not to obtain what one wants is suffering. In short, the 5 aggregates affected by clinging are suffering. This is called suffering. What is the origin of suffering? It is craving, which brings renewal of being, is accompanied by delight and lust, and delights in this and that. That is, craving for sensual pleasures, craving for being, and craving for non-being. This is called the origin of suffering. And what is the cessation of suffering? It is the remainderless fading away and ceasing, the giving up, relinquishing, letting go, and rejecting of that same craving. This is called the cessation of suffering. And what is the way leading to the cessation of suffering? It is just this noble eightfold path, that is, right view, etc., right concentration. This is called the way leading to the cessation of suffering. When a noble disciple has thus understood suffering, the origin of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the way leading to the cessation of suffering, he here and now makes an end of suffering. In that way, too, a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dharma. Saying, "Good friend," the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Shariputra's words. Then they asked him a further question. But friend, might there be another way in which a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dharma? There might be, friends. When, friends, a noble disciple understands aging and death, the origin of aging and death, the cessation of aging and death, and the way leading to the cessation of aging and death, in that way he is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dharma. And what is aging and death? What is the origin of aging and death? What is the cessation of aging and death? What is the way leading to the cessation of aging and death? The aging of beings in the various orders of beings, their old age, brokenness of teeth, grayness of hair, wrinkling of skin, decline of life, weakness of faculties. This is called aging. The passing of beings out of the various orders of beings, their passing away, dissolution, disappearance, dying, completion of time, dissolution of the aggregates, laying down of the body. This is called death. So, this aging and this death are what is called aging and death. With the arising of birth, there is the arising of aging and death. With the cessation of birth, there is the cessation of aging and death. The way leading to the cessation of aging and death is just this noble eightfold path, that is, right view, etc., right concentration. When a noble disciple has thus understood aging and death, the origin of aging and death, the cessation of aging and death, and the way leading to the cessation of aging and death, he here and now makes an end of suffering. In that way, too, a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dharma. Saying, "Good friend," the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Shariputra's words. Then they asked him a further question. "But, friend, might there be another way in which a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dharma?" There might be, friends. When, friends, a noble disciple understands birth, the origin of birth, the cessation of birth, and the way leading to the cessation of birth, in that way he is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dharma. And what is birth? What is the origin of birth? What is the cessation of birth? What is the way leading to the cessation of birth? The birth of beings into the various orders of beings, their coming to birth, precipitation in a womb, generation, manifestation of the aggregates, obtaining the bases for contact. This is called birth. With the arising of being, there is the arising of birth. With the cessation of being, there is the cessation of birth. The way leading to the cessation of birth is just this Noble Eightfold Path, that is, right view, etc., right concentration. When a noble disciple has thus understood birth, the origin of birth, the cessation of birth, and the way leading to the cessation of birth, he here and now makes an end of suffering. In that way, too, a noble disciple is one of right view, and has arrived at this true Dharma. Saying, "Good friend," the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Shariputra's words. Then they asked him a further question. "But, friend, might there be another way in which a noble disciple is one of right view, and has arrived at this true Dharma?" There might be, friends. When, friends, a noble disciple understands being, the origin of being, the cessation of being, and the way leading to the cessation of being, in that way he is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dharma. And what is being? What is the origin of being? What is the cessation of being? What is the way leading to the cessation of being? There are these three kinds of being: sense sphere being, fine material being, and immaterial being. With the arising of clinging, there is the arising of being. With the cessation of clinging, there is the cessation of being. The way leading to the cessation of being is just this Noble Eightfold Path, that is, right view, etc., right concentration. When a noble disciple has thus understood being, the origin of being, the cessation of being, and the way leading to the cessation of being, he here and now makes an end of suffering. In that way, too, a noble disciple is one of right view, and has arrived at this true Dharma. Saying, "Good friend," the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Shariputra's words. Then they asked him a further question. "But, friend, might there be another way in which a noble disciple is one of right view, and has arrived at this true Dharma?" There might be, friends. When, friends, a noble disciple understands clinging, the origin of clinging, the cessation of clinging, and the way leading to the cessation of clinging, in that way he is one of right view, and has arrived at this true Dharma. And what is clinging? What is the origin of clinging? What is the cessation of clinging? And what is the way leading to the cessation of clinging? There are these four kinds of clinging: clinging to sensual desires, clinging to views, clinging to rituals and observances, and clinging to a doctrine of self. With the arising of craving, there is the arising of clinging. With the cessation of craving, there is the cessation of clinging. The way leading to the cessation of clinging is just this Noble Eightfold Path, that is, right view, etc., right concentration. When a noble disciple has thus understood clinging, the origin of clinging, the cessation of clinging, and the way leading to the cessation of clinging, he here and now makes an end of suffering. In that way, too, a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dharma. Saying, "Good friend," the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Shariputra's words. Then they asked him a further question. "But, friend, might there be another way in which a noble disciple is one of right view, and has arrived at this true Dharma?" There might be, friends. When, friends, a noble disciple understands craving, the origin of craving, the cessation of craving, and the way leading to the cessation of craving, in that way he is one of right view, and has arrived at this true Dharma. And what is craving? What is the origin of craving? What is the cessation of craving? What is the way leading to the cessation of craving? There are these 6 classes of craving: craving for forms, craving for sounds, craving for odors, craving for flavors, craving for tangibles, craving for mind objects. With the arising of feeling, there is the arising of craving. With the cessation of feeling, there is the cessation of craving. The way leading to the cessation of craving is just this Noble Eightfold Path, that is, right view, etc., right concentration. When a noble disciple has thus understood craving, the origin of craving, the cessation of craving, and the way leading to the cessation of craving, he here and now makes an end of suffering. In that way, too, a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dharma. Saying, "Good friend," the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Shariputra's words. Then they asked him a further question. "But friend, might there be another way in which a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dharma?" There might be, friends. When, friends, a noble disciple understands feeling, the origin of feeling, the cessation of feeling, and the way leading to the cessation of feeling, in that way he is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dharma. And what is feeling? What is the origin of feeling? What is the cessation of feeling? What is the way leading to the cessation of feeling? There are these 6 classes of feeling. Feeling born of eye contact, feeling born of ear contact, feeling born of nose contact, feeling born of tongue contact, feeling born of body contact, feeling born of mind contact. With the arising of contact, there is the arising of feeling. With the cessation of contact, there is the cessation of feeling. The way leading to the cessation of feeling is just this Noble Eightfold Path. That is, right view, etc., right concentration. When a noble disciple has thus understood feeling, the origin of feeling, the cessation of feeling, and the way leading to the cessation of feeling, he here and now makes an end of suffering. In that way, too, a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dharma. Saying, "Good friend," the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Shariputra's words. Then they asked him a further question. "But friend, might there be another way in which a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dharma?" There might be, friends. When, friends, a noble disciple understands contact, the origin of contact, the cessation of contact, and the way leading to the cessation of contact, in that way he is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dharma. And what is contact? What is the origin of contact? What is the cessation of contact? What is the way leading to the cessation of contact? There are these 6 classes of contact: eye contact, ear contact, nose contact, tongue contact, body contact, mind contact. With the arising of the 6-fold base, there is the arising of contact. With the cessation of the 6-fold base, there is the cessation of contact. The way leading to the cessation of contact is just this Noble Eightfold Path. That is, right view, etc., right concentration. When a noble disciple has thus understood contact, the origin of contact, the cessation of contact, and the way leading to the cessation of contact, he here and now makes an end of suffering. In that way, too, a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dharma. Saying, "Good friend," the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Shariputra's words. Then they asked him a further question. "But friend, might there be another way in which a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dharma?" There might be, friends. When, friends, a noble disciple understands the 6-fold base, the origin of the 6-fold base, the cessation of the 6-fold base, and the way leading to the cessation of the 6-fold base, he is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dharma. And what is the 6-fold base? What is the origin of the 6-fold base? What is the cessation of the 6-fold base? What is the way leading to the cessation of the 6-fold base? There are these 6 bases: the eye base, the ear base, the nose base, the tongue base, the body base, the mind base. With the arising of mentality materiality, there is the arising of the 6-fold base. With the cessation of mentality materiality, there is the cessation of the 6-fold base. The way leading to the cessation of the 6-fold base is just this Noble Eightfold Path. That is, right view, etc., right concentration. When a noble disciple has thus understood the 6-fold base, the origin of the 6-fold base, the cessation of the 6-fold base, and the way leading to the cessation of the 6-fold base, he here and now makes an ending of suffering. In that way, too, a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dharma. Saying, "Good friend," the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Shariputra's words. Then they asked him a further question. "But friend, might there be another way in which a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dharma?" There might be, friends. When, friends, a noble disciple understands mentality materiality, the origin of mentality materiality, the cessation of mentality materiality, and the way leading to the cessation of mentality materiality, in that way he is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dharma. And what is mentality materiality? What is the origin of mentality materiality? what is the cessation of mentality materiality, and what is the way leading to the cessation of mentality materiality. Feeling, perception, volition, contact, and attention. These are called mentality. The four great elements and the material form derived from the four great elements. These are called materiality. So, this mentality and this materiality are what is called mentality materiality. With the arising of consciousness, there is the arising of mentality materiality. With the cessation of consciousness, there is the cessation of mentality materiality. The way leading to the cessation of mentality materiality is just this Noble Eightfold Path. That is, right view, etc., right concentration. When a noble disciple has thus understood mentality materiality, the origin of mentality materiality, the cessation of mentality materiality, and the way leading to the cessation of mentality materiality, he here and now makes an end of suffering. In that way, too, a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dharma. Saying, "Good friend," the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Shariputra's words. Then they asked him a further question. "But friend, might there be another way in which a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dharma?" There might be, friends. When, friends, a noble disciple understands consciousness, the origin of consciousness, the cessation of consciousness, and the way leading to the cessation of consciousness, in that way he is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dharma. And what is consciousness? What is the origin of consciousness? What is the cessation of consciousness? What is the way leading to the cessation of consciousness? There are 6 classes of consciousness: eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, mind consciousness. With the arising of formations, there is the arising of consciousness. With the cessation of formations, there is the cessation of consciousness. The way leading to the cessation of consciousness is just this Noble Eightfold Path. That is, right view, etc., right concentration. When a noble disciple has thus understood consciousness, the origin of consciousness, the cessation of consciousness, and the way leading to the cessation of consciousness, he here and now makes an end of suffering. In that way, too, a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dharma. Saying, "Good friend," the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Shariputra's words. Then they asked him a further question. "But friend, might there be another way in which a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dharma?" There might be, friends. When, friends, a noble disciple understands formations, the origin of formations, the cessation of formations, and the way leading to the cessation of formations, in that way he is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dharma. And what are formations? What is the origin of formations? What is the cessation of formations? And what is the way leading to the cessation of formations? There are these 3 kinds of formations: the bodily formation, the verbal formation, the mental formation. With the arising of ignorance, there is the arising of formations. With the cessation of ignorance, there is the cessation of formations. The way leading to the cessation of formations is just this Noble Eightfold Path. That is, right view, etc., right concentration. When a noble disciple has thus understood formations, the origin of formations, the cessation of formations, and the way leading to the cessation of formations, he here and now makes an end of suffering. In that way, too, a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dharma. Saying, "Good friend," the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Shariputra's words. Then they asked him a further question. "But friend, might there be another way in which a noble disciple is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dharma?" There might be, friends. When, friends, a noble disciple understands ignorance, the origin of ignorance, the cessation of ignorance, and the way leading to the cessation of ignorance, in that way he is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dharma. And what is ignorance? What is the origin of ignorance? What is the cessation of ignorance? And what is the way leading to the cessation of ignorance? Not knowing about suffering, not knowing about the origin of suffering, not knowing about the cessation of suffering, not knowing about the way leading to the cessation of suffering. This is called ignorance. With the arising of the taints, there is the arising of ignorance. With the cessation of the taints, there is the cessation of ignorance. The way leading to the cessation of ignorance is just this Noble Eightfold Path. That is, right view, etc., right concentration. When a noble disciple has thus understood ignorance, the origin of ignorance, the cessation of ignorance, and the way leading to the cessation of ignorance, he here and now makes an end of suffering. In that way, too, a noble disciple is one of right view, and has arrived at this true Dharma. Saying, "Good friend," the bhikkhus delighted and rejoiced in the Venerable Shariputra's words. Then they asked him a further question. "But, friend, might there be another way in which a noble disciple is one of right view, whose view is straight, who has perfect confidence in the Dharma, and has arrived at this true Dharma?" There might be, friends. When, friends, a noble disciple understands the taints, the origin of the taints, the cessation of the taints, and the way leading to the cessation of the taints, in that way he is one of right view, whose view is straight, who has perfect confidence in the Dharma, and has arrived at this true Dharma. And what are the taints? What is the origin of the taints? What is the cessation of the taints? What is the way leading to the cessation of the taints? There are three taints: the taint of sensual desire, the taint of being, and the taint of ignorance. With the arising of ignorance, there is the arising of the taints. With the cessation of ignorance, there is the cessation of the taints. The way leading to the cessation of the taints is just this Noble Eightfold Path, that is, right view, etc., right concentration. When a noble disciple has understood the taints, the origin of the taints, the cessation of the taints, and the way leading to the cessation of the taints, he entirely abandons the underlying tendency to lust, he abolishes the underlying tendency to aversion, he extirpates the underlying tendency to the view and conceit, "I am," and by abandoning ignorance and arousing true knowledge, he here and now makes an end of suffering. In that way, too, a noble disciple is one of right view, whose view is straight, who has perfect confidence in the Dharma, and has arrived at this true Dharma. That is what the Venerable Shariputra said. The bhikkhus were satisfied and delighted in the Venerable Shariputra's words. So that was the Sammādiṭṭhi Sutta given by Shariputra. Docs, what did you think?
This was interesting. So, more or less, this is restating stuff that the Buddha has already said, that we've already examined in other sutra episodes, but kind of from a different angle, sort of. A different way of saying what has already been said. So, one spot that I found particularly interesting is that the characters in this are calling each other friend or friends. Usually it's bhikkhus and the like, so this is Sariputra instead of the Buddha speaking, so I think I see what's going on here. This is an intentional choice from everyone involved. Sariputra is venerable and referred to as the Venerable Sariputra, but that's not the same level as the Buddha. Calling the Buddha friend and the like would be a level of familiarity that probably isn't okay for a lot of reasons. But the distance between Sariputra and the other bhikkhus is less, so this familiar and equanimous way of referring to each other fits better, I think.
It does, and this is not a case where it's like a translation decision or a translation issue. It is absolutely sort of like a same rank way to refer to, your audience. And in that way, it is fascinating because you're starting to see how the community, how the Sangha sort of refer to each other and how they think of each other. And you're starting to see sort of Shariputra's place in it. And I think that's fascinating, and you mentioned this is stuff that we've seen before that's being stated in a different way or from a different angle. And I completely agree. One of the reasons this is like one of my favorite sutras in the Pali Canon is because it definitely drives home the fact that the readers typically in this day and age have the entire canon available to them. And this is likely not the first sutra that they read. And so they might feel like, oh, I know all of this. I've seen all of this before. The Buddha has told me all of this, especially if you have the Mahayana canon available to you. You're like, oh, I know all of this and more. But whenever you are practicing, especially in the distant past, this is a very fascinating sort of reformulation of the Buddha's teaching because, one, it's coming from one of his students, someone who's actually like practicing it and training it and trying to do it. And two, because it's coming from somebody who is roughly the same rank as you, or at least, you're both monks or renunciants as opposed to you're a monk and you're hearing it from the Buddha himself. So this is a fascinating sutra because of that sort of position that Shariputra finds himself in.
This is also a very formulaic one. This is one of the longer ones that I could actually picture myself trying to memorize, because so much of it is repetition. It's also one where you can tell that the Shariputra's audience isn't the bhikkhus he's speaking to, it's the readers. The bhikkhus feeding questions to Sariputra are definitely doing this to set Sariputra up rather than trying to get more information for themselves. They do get that information for themselves, but this feels a whole lot more like a fable or something where the participants are not the actual audience for the speech.
Absolutely, yeah. It's for structural reasons that the questions that they ask are sort of fed to them after the fact, and it would be interesting if we had it, if it exists, to sort of compare this product to a real sermon, if one ever actually did happen, and see, how did they actually go through all this stuff? How did Shariputra actually preach this? How did he go about sort of structuring what he talked about, if he ever did, of course.
Any other things about the overall sutra before I go into specifics?
No, go ahead.
All right. So now let's get into specifics of the sutra. So we have the paragraph about what is the root of the wholesome. And so I don't know if this is a translation or if it's in the original text, but what we get is non-greed, non-hate, and non-delusion. And that is instead of generosity, compassion, and wisdom, which would be the positive way to refer to these things. Am I catching on to a translation wrinkle, or are the non-versions of these distinct from the positive versions?
They actually are distinct, and it's interesting that you brought that up. So we're just coming off of episode 113, just recorded that at the time of recording this, and there was a point in that episode where I mentioned that the Buddha is thought to be the master of abstaining from violence, but also the perfection of its opposite. And this is sort of what this is pointing to. Non-greed, non-hate, non-delusion are abstaining from the three poisons, whereas generosity, compassion, and wisdom are their opposites. So it's the difference between abstinences and positively seeking for something instead of seeking to stop something, seeking against something. And in that way, it's kind of a very specific way to situate how this factors into dependent origination and into right view. Very early in Buddhism's history, abstinences are much more heavily emphasized than the opposite of the thing that you are abstaining from. So just eliminating greed, eliminating hate, eliminating delusion itself was emphasized much more highly over generating or propagating or cultivating generosity, compassion, and wisdom. Later on, these things became seen to be as one and the same. So if you're moving away from practicing greed, moving away from hate, moving away from delusion, there's no way not to move toward generosity, compassion, and wisdom. But the distinction is there in the Pali Canon, because it's regarding the path as being much more difficult. It's like you can't even start going for generosity, compassion, and wisdom until you have stopped greed, hate, and delusion. It doesn't regard those as being two sides of the same coin, where stopping one is doing the other. So that's kind of an interesting little change that happens in the texts, even as the Pali Canon goes from, the first few sermons to later sermons, because, the path is so centered on diagnosing and situating every single phenomenon, experience, and situation into the path of enlightenment. So it's not as simple as just do this instead. It's more like practice these complicated steps to stop doing this, and then you'll be able to start practicing the complicated steps to start doing something else.
That makes sense, and it also nails in that the language going on in this sutra is extremely precise, which I suspect makes it quite difficult to translate.
Absolutely.
All right, so moving on, let's talk about nutriment. So that's an interesting word to use in this entire section. And what is nutriment? What is the origin of nutriment? What is the cessation of nutriment? What is the way leading to the cessation of nutriment? It seems like the word nutriment is standing in for desire. Again, as we talked about before, this is saying things that we've seen before, but from a different angle. This is talking about things nourishing negative properties. So instead of here are some bad things that prevent enlightenment, it's here are some things that nourish unenlightenment. And so, as said, it's the same thing that's been said before, reframed from a different direction.
Exactly, yeah. And you've hit right on it. Yeah, nutriment is speaking to, the objects of desire and the desire itself that feeds into attachment, feeds into delusion, feeds into the three poisons and stuff like that. And this isn't the only place in the canon where you will see desire and its object as being called nutriment or nourishment. But, it's not my favorite framing because it really confuses people. People think that nourishment or nutriment is a good thing, at least in the English-speaking world. And if they're coming at this as a beginner, then they're going to miss that because this text did not have a footnote explaining all of this. And I only know this because I've read other stuff. And so you have to be careful if you're like a beginner and you're reading these texts and you see something like that. Because of these translation concerns, don't automatically assume in every case, where it could go either way, that what you're looking at has a positive connotation. Because as you point out in this one, it actually has a pretty bad one. It feeds that which sort of keeps us locked in the cycle of desire, attachment, dukkha, desire, attachment, dukkha. So yeah, that's a good spot to zoom in on for a moment, just to make clear that distinction.
In today's context, I cannot think of any instances where I've heard of nourishment not being a wholesome thing. We think of things that are nourishing as good things, but in this case, it is nourishing something that is negative. And yeah, I could see that being a contributing factor into why Buddhism is often framed as being so fatalistic. It's like, here's a spot where nourishment is being called a bad thing. And when you're in the context, it's nourishing something negative, but a shallow or a reader who does not have the context that we've gotten from doing however many 100 episodes of this show we've done could see that and being like, oh, Buddhism is saying that nourishing yourself is bad.
Exactly, yeah. And, the truth is, when you look at the words, it actually is saying that. It is saying that, with different definitions and connotations, it is saying that the continued nourishment of the idea of self that exists in one's mind is not a good thing. You're feeding a delusion. And so, with that meaning, with that explanation, it's not fatalistic, but just looking at the words themselves, you immediately think, wow, yeah, they're saying that I need to stop nourishing myself. And you can sort of misunderstand the whole point.
Yeah, especially if you are still wrapped up in that delusion yourself.
Exactly.
So after that, we talk about the noble truths, and we've kind of already talked about that enough that I don't see a whole lot to dig into here. Again, this is Sariputra reframing something that the Buddha has already said several times.
Exactly. And, if there's anything I would point out here, it's just simply that as the sutra goes on formulaically, he will use the formula of the Four Noble Truths to discuss many more topics. So we're going to be talking about X, the origin of X, the cessation of X, and the way leading to the cessation of X. The Four Noble Truths, substitute X with suffering. You understand suffering, the origin of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the way leading to the cessation of suffering. As we go forward, we're going to be talking about other stuff in place of suffering. And we're going to use that same formula over and over again. And I think that that's a very good, positive, interesting synthesis between the formula of the Four Noble Truths and the topics we talk about.
Yeah, it uses the Four Noble Truths to kind of divide and conquer the problems that we're getting into.
Exactly.
So next we get into the 12 links of dependent origination, so aging and death and all of that. This is also something that we've talked about before, but this time it's going from the surface level. So we start with aging and death, and then we dig further down into birth and rebirth, and go through that whole chain, starting from the top down instead of from the core out here. And that makes sense because we, as beings in samsara, see the top layer first. Like, we know what aging and death is. We can observe it. And so that is the part where somebody who is new to this way of thinking would want to start, because it's the part that we understand the best. And then we dig down into more fundamental ideas. So, how craving and desire leads to clinging attachment, etc. And I feel like we've actually had something similar to this in a previous sutra episode where we start from the top and go down again. I don't remember which one that was, since we've done so many.
I don't remember that either. We have done a lot. But you're right that this is a deliberate teaching choice to start with that which is obvious and observable, and then sort of build out the causal links backwards, rather than starting with, ignorance, or otherwise starting with the most complicated and most abstract thing, and then working your way forward to the most obvious and present thing. That's done plenty of times in other sutras, and not just with the 12 links of dependent origination, as in this one. And I think it's good teaching. I think it makes sense why they would want to do that. And I think that structurally and narratively, it sort of makes the text build on itself and makes the ideas that are being discussed there sort of build on themselves in an interesting way, because we discuss different types and different causes and different natures of all 12 of these links. And at first, when we're talking about aging and death, then we're talking about obvious stuff. Brokenness of teeth, grayness of hair, wrinkling of skin, decline of life, weakness of faculties. That's all simple, that's very obvious. That happens to every human being that undergoes aging. But then, when we get to the more complicated stuff later on, we're talking about things that are really abstract and can be really hard to sort of grip whenever you haven't gone through the obvious stuff first. If you're just thrown into the middle of this and you're looking at the 6 classes of consciousness, eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, etc., that's hard. What are we talking about? It's not intelligible immediately by itself. So we need to go through that obvious stuff first.
The first layer of this that I think is actually difficult to wrap one's head around is being. So talking about the origin of being, the cessation of being, etc. So let's talk a little bit more about that. So existence itself is what we're talking about here. Is that what being is existing? And therefore, again, talking about how Buddhism is regarded as nihilistic, existing is a link in an overall negative chain. So what is really being spoken of when we're talking about the word being?
Yeah, we're talking about continued existence in samsara. We talk about Buddhism being called fatalistic. Unfortunately, for, people who have that view, for us who don't have that view, it is true that Buddhism views our continued existence, our continued reincarnation in the cycle of samsara, as overall not that great of a thing. We are urged to do something, to make some sort of change, either to exit that cycle, via the Arhat path and nirvana and so on, or to, in some way, radically change the nature of this cycle via the bodhisattva path and saving everybody in it, saving everybody in samsara. So there are different aspects of being, different natures of being, different kinds of being that are discussed in this text, in this section. But overall, all of it is related to just the different ways that you can understand that someone is trapped in samsara. They are stuck going in circles in the realm of rebirth, of death and rebirth.
So we get to the question, what is being, what is the origin of being, what is the cessation of being, what is the way leading to the cessation of being. And when we answer that first question, what is being, the answer is there are these three kinds of being: sense-sphere being, fine material being, and immaterial being. So trying to translate that a bit, we're talking sense-sphere being as the senses, fine material being as the physical body, and immaterial being as consciousness? ?
Yeah, you're mostly right there. So immaterial being is consciousness, and sense sphere being is physical body. So the physical body is that which can be grasped by the six senses because it can be touched, smelled, tasted, heard, thought about, etc. But fine material being is sort of interesting. Fine material being is sort of like the in the middle between that which is material and immaterial. It's something for which there is evidence that it is there, but not that can be seen or sensed with the naked eye or what have you. So this is a Hindu cosmological thing that sort of gets inherited into Buddhism, but there's this sort of idea of atomism going around in the religious environment of ancient India when this stuff is being sort of practiced, and on into when it starts to get written down. And sometimes there's these weird references, and I say weird because Buddhism generally disagrees with atomism. And there's cases in sutras we've read before where the Buddha actually gives arguments directly to atomists who he decided are wrong. But there are these weird references to atomistic ways of viewing the physical world that pop up sometimes. And this fine material being is one of them. So it's speaking kind of like to atoms. The fine material being is sort of like this atomic way of being, if that makes sense. It's not quite immaterial, but it also can't be sensed with our six senses. So it's not something that's tangible or observable, but it is not also immaterial because it does leave a trace and it does act in the world that we live in right now. And that's kind of similar to how we understand atoms in our modern Western chemistry spheres. They're things that can't be seen with the naked eye, but they absolutely do act on our physical world. And so kind of an odd inclusion here. It's possibly partial evidence that Shariputra has not been sort of disabused of some potentially incorrect atomistic views.
But with that extra context, it could also, now that I've heard that, what I'm thinking is that fine material being would be components of the body. So rather than talking about atoms, we're reading current modern day scientific understanding of the world, we would be talking about cells. So blood cells, skin cells, hair cells, etc. And that still works in this context because what we're talking about is too small to be examined without a microscope, which is something that Sariputra would not have had.
Yeah, you can understand it that way for sure.
So, moving forward, we get to the section on clinging. So, these are the four kinds of clinging. Clinging to sensual pleasures, clinging to views, clinging to rituals and observances, and clinging to a doctrine of self. So the first two and the last one are pretty straightforward. When we're clinging to sensual pleasures, it's I'm clinging to how much I like the taste of this food. When we're clinging to views, I'm clinging to this is the way I think the world works. When we're clinging to a doctrine of self, go all the way back to Descartes, I think therefore I am, is clinging to that idea. Clinging to rituals and observances, however, that's an interesting piece of this puzzle. So it almost feels like this is talking about superstition, even. Clinging to the idea that the ritual that I'm doing has some kind of effect. Clinging to the idea that this particular day is sacred for some reason. Am I on the right track there?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad that you zoomed in on that one because that's actually one of my favorite inclusions in this text. This is a phrase that sort of renders it clear to me how and why Shariputra comes to be regarded as foremost in wisdom, and I'll sort of explain why. So you're right that it is referring to clinging to superstitions that when you do rituals and you do observances, that they have some sort of effect on spirits or gods or on some sort of supernatural. And I'm being specific here, supernatural, outside of natural or above natural forces. But in Buddhism, interestingly, there's this sort of two-sided relationship, or maybe there's two aspects of the relationship that Buddhism has to ritual. On the one hand, Buddhism inherits a lot of ritual modes and observances from Hinduism and Brahmanical rituals, and is very faithful to those observances. You know, there's holidays, there's specific procedures and rituals. There's lots of things that are regarded as ritualistically proper. There's a lot of concern for ritual propriety, even in Indian Buddhism, even before we get to China, where ritual propriety is a serious Confucian thing. At the same time, at the very, very same time, there is this understanding that rituals and observances can be potential places where practitioners who are on the path of enlightenment, who have renounced, who have become monks, they're potential traps where people can get super attached to stuff. So imagine that you are a monk, you've just ordained, right? And, you know, the absolute truth is, if you are ordaining and it is a time in history where you don't have access to the internet, to the Canon, to all the sutras, you haven't done any studying prior to, you don't know anything about Buddhism, except for that this monk tells you that you'll attain psychic powers, or that you'll go to a place called nirvana where you're not subject to any sort of dukkha at all. Or look at how happy and peaceful and joyous and rapturous and equanimous we all are compared to somebody else, right? So you're entering this community, and at best, you have a cursory understanding of what they're actually about, because you haven't learned it yet. You haven't done any of the studying to figure out what Buddhism actually is. When you start doing rituals, you will be presented early on with a very simplistic, mechanistic, instrumental way of how they work. Whenever I put this piece of wood in the fire, it causes the wish that is written on that piece of wood to transport from this realm to the realm of the Buddha, and he reads it and he grants it for you. That is a very simplistic, mechanistic, instrumental, incorrect, I might add, way to understand the Goma ritual, which is a very important and central ritual in esoteric Buddhism. And immediately, somebody who has no idea what's going on, they're going to be like, oh, I can get all my wishes granted this way? That's incredible. So they'll start, wishing. They'll start getting super attached to the ritual because they think that it grants them wishes. Or even if you have more than a cursory understanding and you think, oh, this Goma ritual is going to get me free from all detachments. It's going to get me enlightened. It's going to get me further along on the Bodhisattva path. Even then, you have a more complicated understanding because you know what your goals are supposed to be, but you're still sort of thinking of the ritual mechanistically, as in, I put in input A, I get output B. You're still sort of potentially going to become attached. You're still potentially going to become desirous and attached to what you think you're getting out of the ritual. And that's another trap, right? And so it's important in Buddhism, critically important, and has been since day one, as is clear by this sutta, that you observe rituals and you do ritual things correctly, but you don't get attached to what you think are the fruits of those rituals, what you think are the outcomes of those rituals, what you think are the sort of, the things that pay back toward you from doing them, because that is clinging, that is attachment, right? It is a potential thing that you can get stuck on.
It's also selfish.
It's very selfish, right? Because, Goma in particular, I just go back to that example because I brought it up before. Goma is really meant to be universal. It's meant to be for all sentient beings everywhere. And the way that it actually affects, the mechanism by which it affects and touches all sentient beings everywhere is protected behind an initiation. It's protected by a Dharma transmission. There's a wall there. We can't know on this show. We can't know how that works. But thinking of it as, oh, my wish will be granted is completely selfish. So in that way, I think that it's incredible that Shariputra makes it obvious and clear at his stage in this sermon that, that's a kind of clinging that people can get stuck on. I think that actually is like a really smart and really interesting inclusion.
So that makes sense and does answer the question that came with it. So let's move forward. So the next spot I wanted to zoom in on is the sixfold base section. So I don't really understand what the word base means here. The previous section is feeling, contact, and then the next section is mentality, materiality. And it's unclear to me what base means here. We've already established that this is a sutta that is very precise in its language, and the word base can mean so many different things that I'm having a hard time following here. So, is this the things being sensed in the context section? Are these the senses themselves, and the contacts from the previous section refer to the interaction between object and sensor? Explain this a little bit for me, please.
Absolutely, yeah. These are just the senses themselves.
Okay.
Right, so in contact is sort of an interesting thing in Buddhism because it relies on three factors. It relies on eyes, sight, and something visible, or otherwise tongues, taste, something tasteable. So it's more complicated than it seems on the surface. This is just diving straight into the sense itself. So we said eyes, sight, something visible. The sixfold base is sight, taste, touch, sound, or, audibility, and, something that can be thought of. You could say like something that is conscionable or considerable or something like that. It's just the sense itself.
Okay, makes sense. So contact is a verb in this case, and the sixfold base are the nouns that are doing the verb?
Exactly, yeah. Or at least they are the noun version of the verb, right? So the noun version of seeing is sight.
Makes sense. Okay, that clears up my confusion there. So let's move on to mentality and materiality. So in the notes, you mentioned that you don't like this translation, and I kind of agree, but we should talk about this here a bit. So why don't you like this translation, and what would you do instead, perhaps?
So this is a translation, mentality, materiality, that you will see in other places besides just this text. And it kind of baffles me because that is a word that to me is almost nonsensical. I don't actually, just looking at that word, have any idea what it's referring to or what it means. And so I actually encountered this in graduate school a couple of times and asked some questions about it. And what I found was that the Sanskrit behind it is actually Namarupa in Sanskrit.
I remember rupa being form.
Exactly, yes. And Sanskrit is an Indo-European language from which all European languages are derived, and nama is name. It's like a one-to-one translation, which is rare in translating Sanskrit to English. But this is a case where it's name. So Namarupa translates to name hyphen and hyphen form. Name and form, all one word. And this is interesting. So what I understand from their use of the mentality materiality word is that they're referring basically to the idea that something has sensibility to our six senses. It also has a name or an idea associated with it, a perception associated with it. So it's kind of weird in that way. It's referring basically to how something exists and how we perceive it, how we sort of, engage with it because we have consciousness. It's a lot harder to get to the real meaning of that word using mentality materiality than it is name and form. Name and form refers to the fact that all things in reality have a name, which is assigned by the mind of a living being. This is like the mental image that's triggered by a word. The word cup makes you think of a cup. Cups also have form, which is not assigned by consciousness. The shape of a cup is not mentally assigned. It is there regardless of if we call it cup, mug, or chair. Name and form are mutually dependent and inseparable. Everything that has a form has a name, and everything that has a name has a form. Without one or the other, something loses its identity in reality entirely. So this is just simply speaking to the fact that everything that exists in reality has something that is assigned by a mind and something that is not assigned by a mind. It has something that is sort of intrinsic, which is form, and it has something extrinsic, which is name or concept, right? And in this section, whenever he asks the question, and what is mentality, materiality, he answers it by saying feeling, perception, volition, contact, and attention. These are called mentality. Those are the 5 aggregates that make up all of reality. We've talked about those before on the show. And then he says the 4 great elements and the material form derived from the 4 great elements are materiality. So these are not the 5 aggregates. These are, in Hindu cosmology and Buddhist cosmology, these 4 great elements, air, earth, water, fire, these are sort of the pillars of all material in samsara, in the universe, in reality. So it's kind of a bad translation for what could have been a pretty simple concept, but is made more complicated by that choice of word. When you're translating anything, the thing that you choose to stand in for the original language should, at the very least, not make the idea more complicated in the target language. It should stay the same or even make it simpler, if possible.
Makes sense, and name and form would make this a much easier read. Not only are the component words much simpler, but they also describe what's going on here much better. The fact that we name things that we see, and we're always going to do that, and if we sense something new that we don't have a name for, we're going to make up a name for it. And this section is talking about how that process that I just described is a problem, is something that the Buddhist path would eventually remove. When you are in a full state of enlightenment, you have things like non-duality being why are we naming these different forms different things? It's all the same.
Yeah, exactly. Or, or otherwise, it's seeking to eliminate sort of that almost computational or almost involuntarily executed action of the brain, where when someone says elephant, the first thing that your brain pops up with in your head is an image of the animal that you know to be an elephant. It's sort of breaking that one-to-one relationship between the conception you have of an elephant and the animal itself. And so, that's a huge concern of Buddhist texts and Buddhist perception and Buddhist consciousness, is to break the relationship between the referent and the reference. So, the referring and the thing being referred to. Breaking that relationship or changing that relationship for the better is sort of central to reshaping your entire consciousness, because it is in that relationship that your brain has that conceptions or opinions or, volitions can take root, because you start to make judgments about that relationship. The relationship in my head between tiger and the animal itself is sort of colored by the violence that I know that tigers can exact upon people, right? And in Buddhism, it would be okay, well, no, consider the fact that the tiger is a living thing. Consider the fact that its violence or its potential for violence is only a small aspect of its existence, and so on and so forth, to the point where you're sort of stripping away different components of this relationship that your brain has created, because it is a consciousness that exists in samsara, and it needs to make these relationships for survival reasons and for the continuance of feeding the delusion of capital S self.
So somebody who has properly achieved the cessation of name and form, if I tell you do not think of a pink elephant, you're going to think of a pink elephant. It's a reflex that we can't really deactivate because of name and form. And so an enlightened person would actually be able to follow that order, right?
Yes, or at least they would sort of acknowledge or realize or experience that the person saying that has a specific idea of what they believe pink is or what elephant is. And they would realize the fallibility of that sort of conception. And they would come back and ask a bunch of qualifying questions. They would be like, well, what species of elephant? Well, is this pink one imaginary or not imaginary? What shade of pink are you talking about? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It wouldn't be annoying, so to speak, but it would kind of be like, okay, well, be extraordinarily specific, because what you're talking about is a very actually shady idea. It's very sketchy and very nebulous and mercurial. and it doesn't actually have a firm referent. And so if we're going to communicate about it, you need to sort of be more clear, be more specific, be more true to language or to reality, rather than sort of riding the line between both.
Okay, I get that. So, last thing I wanted to bring out is the sutta finishes with taints. So, taints, the origin of the taints, the cessation of the taints, and the way leading to the cessation of the taints. We ask, and what are the taints? We get the answer, there are the three taints. The taints of sensual desire, the taint of being, and the taint of ignorance. So, let's talk about this a bit. Sensual desire, being, and ignorance are all further up on this chain. They've already been mentioned in the sutta, and it feels like this would kind of loop back around to the top of this chain we're making. So, explain this a little more. What is Sariputra talking about when he's talking about the taints?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. So, typically whenever you get presentations of the 12 links of dependent origination, the first or the last one, depending on which direction, your explanation is going in, the first or the last one will be ignorance. And we just did ignorance. And so after doing ignorance, he has added this section on taints. And it's kind of an open-ended question as to why he has added that and if that's actually one of the links of dependent origination or not, right? Because like you say, it refers to stuff that we have already covered, such as being, ignorance, and sensual desire. So my interpretation of why this is added here is to speak about something that you mentioned earlier. You mentioned that this chain is overall bad, and you're right about that. From ignorance comes all of the components, all of the pieces, all the layers of existence in samsara. And all of these are generally referred to as being samsaric, at the very least. Or, depending on who you ask, bad, and stuff that ought to be changed or avoided. So, this is just sort of speaking to the fact that and this entire chain I've just gone through is not good. It is tainted. It is tainted with sensual desire, with continued existence in samsara, and with ignorance. And even though we just did ignorance, we're sort of speaking to the fact that ignorance might be the first or the last link in this chain that we've been talking about, but it pervades all of them. Because whether you're thinking about this from the top layer or from the most bottom layer, as soon as you pull out the Jenga cube of ignorance, the whole tower comes crashing down. So I think that it's referring to that which makes samsara samsaric, that which makes it subject to dukkha, that which makes it subject to delusion, that which makes it subject to all of the unenlightened or unenlightening things about the realm of reality that we live in. And it's kind of, it's confusing because, like you say, it refers to stuff that we have already covered. But that's my best sort of guess, my best interpretation as to why it's here. There's a theory out there that there were originally actually 13 links of dependent origination. And one of the points of evidence for that theory was this, was the fact that we have this taints section. But that's since been discounted because this is one of the only texts where you see taints as one of the links. And very importantly, it's not the Buddha who adds that section. So in every other case, or nearly every other case where you see the 12 links of dependent origination, not only is it the Buddha speaking, but also he doesn't include this section. So that leads people to believe Shariputra included it, or his followers included it, or something, and it's not actually one of the original sort of given presentations of Praticca Samutpada, or 12 links of dependent origination.
And we've talked before and encountered before lines in sutras that seem like they're out of place. And this seems like another one of those. And I think we've floated the idea that could be something that was added after the fact, added by somebody who came after Sariputra. And because of the way the suttas and sutras have been transferred, there's no way we'll ever be able to confirm or disprove that.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, there's some cases where, our best guess is that it was added, and that's kind of general consensus. But like you say, this stuff is lost to time. The thing about the Pali Canon that makes it so fun and interesting to study is that it is in some way living. We come to it thinking that it is dead, in the sense that everything that was written down in it was written down 2,000 years ago and has come to us in some senses unchanged since then. And the newest thing about what you're reading is that it's translated. But, that's actually not the case. There's plenty of cases where the origins of a text and the versions of a text and that which survives and comes to us and that which doesn't, all of these things are very mercurial and very, very built on shifting sands. And the same is true of the Mahayana canon, of course, but it comes through a lot in the Pali canon specifically because these are the oldest texts in Buddhism that we're dealing with. For example, when sutras start to be authored in China, it's so much easier to see, it's not 100% accurate, but it's so much easier to see, oh, there were so many versions of this sutra, or there were this many translations of it at this time, right? Because their papers survived much better than, I believe it's banana leaves that the Pali Canon was originally written down on. And so, because of that more ancient aspect of it, it is an interesting textual history that you're usually dealing with.
All right, I think that got to everything I wanted to talk about. Was there something I missed that you want to bring up?
Nope, that took care of it for me.
Well, in that case, I think we have an episode. Anything else to say before we close out?
Nope, I'm good.
All right, well, listeners, I hope this was interesting. I certainly had a good time talking about it. I like the sutta a lot. This was, just the shape of it, the patterns that it brings out, and the fact that this is a speaker other than the Buddha. This adds a lot more texture to the doctrine, having it from a different person and going in a different direction.
I think so too. I had a great time reading this again and discussing this and finally getting to sort of voice my concerns about mentality materiality as a translation choice.
Yeah. All right, well, I think that's it. Once again, thanks for listening, and hope you join us again next time.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
If you like our show and would like to support us, we ask that you instead send that generous support to a worthy cause. Currently, that is easing the weaponized famine that is tearing through Gaza. Because of blockades, charities and aid organizations can't do much. The best we can do is directly donate to GoFundMe campaigns or the like. For now, we're pointing at the page for Tashneem Mahmood, a mother of 3 who has lost her apartment in the bombing. If you are able, please send some support her way.
My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.